When sanctions against Russia were rolled out in 2022, few believed they would last. The prevailing mood was that it would all be over quickly. The economy would crack, the ruble would collapse, factories would grind to a halt. Politicians in Europe and the United States said as much openly, without euphemisms. The plan was straightforward: cut off access to money, technology, and logistics, and let the economy fall apart on its own. Russia found itself at the center of the largest sanctions experiment in modern history. More than 30,000 restrictions, an all-time record. By comparison, Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined have faced fewer. Over 10,000 of those measures target finance and technology. The rest hit transport, supply chains, and personal assets. The intention was to paralyze the economy. The first months were genuinely rough. Prices jumped, markets panicked, interest rates surged. Then something happened that even the architects of the pressure campaign hadn't anticipated. 2 years on, the economy not only failed to collapse, it grew. According to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Russia's GDP expanded by roughly 5% in 2023, outpacing the global average. That outcome didn't come out of thin air. There was no miracle rebound. The economy turned out to be prepared for this scenario long before the crisis began. The first crucial factor is timing. After 2014, Russia had already been living under restrictions. And over 8 years, it built up a kind of immunity. That's when the country launched its own payment system, Mir, essentially a Visa or MasterCard equivalent without foreign involvement. Today, millions use it nationwide. When Western payment networks began to pull out en masse, Mir simply took their place. Now Russia is pushing the system abroad. Talks are underway with Turkey, Iran, Vietnam, Egypt, the CIS countries, and even individual banks across Asia and Africa. Interest in Mir isn't driven by Russia alone. Many governments are watching how sanctions can rebound on those who impose them and want a fallback of their own. What started as an insurance policy has turned into a real export product. At the same time, Russia put domestic interbank settlement mechanisms to work. When access to SWIFT was curtailed, it became clear that inside the country, and with a number of partners, transactions could continue without it. These technical solutions, built quietly in advance, acted like shock absorbers. No grand announcements, just results. Then there's the structure of the economy itself. The old gas station with nukes cliché didn't survive contact with reality. Oil and gas matter, yes, but they're far from the whole picture. Metallurgy, chemicals, agriculture, machine building, nuclear energy. These are massive sectors too, and they were the ones that pulled the economy through the hardest stretch. Nuclear energy is a story of its own. Here, Russia plays a pivotal role. Rosatom controls nearly half of the global market for enriched uranium and roughly a third of all nuclear power plants currently under construction abroad. In practice, when a new reactor is built anywhere in the world, Russian specialists are very often involved. The most visible examples are Hungary, Turkey, and Egypt. In Hungary, work continues on the Paxta 2 units despite heavy pressure from Brussels. The European Commission initially objected, then granted an exemption, simply because the project cannot be completed without Russian participation. Turkey is building Akkuyu, its first ever nuclear power plant, which will supply about 10% of the country's electricity. Egypt is doing the same. For Cairo, the Russian contract proved the most attractive in terms of cost and timelines. Even countries that loudly criticize Moscow haven't severed ties in the nuclear sector. France still purchases enriched uranium and reprocessing services from Russia. The United States continues to buy Russian fuel for its reactors as well. There's no realistic alternative in the short term. Other suppliers are either more expensive or unable to meet the required volumes. Russia's edge in nuclear power is its full-cycle capability, from uranium mining to plant maintenance and spent fuel removal. No one else offers the same package. That's why sanctions simply don't work here. Without Russian involvement, the industry in many countries would grind to a halt. Another key factor is agriculture. Once sanctions hit, it became clear just how central Russia is to the global food market, and how painful its absence would be for the world, Europe included. Russia accounts for roughly a quarter of global wheat trade, exporting about 35 to 40 million tons a year. In other words, every fourth ton of wheat sold on international markets leaves a Russian port. Without those shipments, serious problems would arise not only in Africa or the Middle East, where Russian wheat is a cornerstone of food security, but in Europe as well. Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, and dozens of other countries buy Russian grain because there simply aren't comparable volumes available elsewhere. In recent seasons, Russia has held the top spot worldwide for wheat exports, ahead of the United States, Canada, and France. Annual shipments consistently exceed 35 million tons, reaching as high as 42 million in bumper years. Russia's share of global grain trade continues to grow. Favorable climate conditions, efficient logistics, and low production costs keep output profitable even amid price swings. Across Africa and the Middle East, Russian grain can cover up to 60% of demand. Without it, local markets would face immediate shortages and price spikes. Europe isn't in much better shape. After cutting back on domestic planting and grappling with higher fertilizer costs, many countries have become effectively dependent on imports. That's why, despite all the rhetoric, grain trade with Russia continues, often through intermediaries, but it continues all the same. One of the factors that allowed Russia to withstand sanctions pressure was the so-called shadow fleet, a vast network of tankers and intermediary companies through which oil and refined products have continued to move. When Western countries imposed price caps and banned the insurance and transport of Russian oil, Moscow rebuilt its export system in a matter of months. Western middlemen were replaced by new players from Asia and the Middle East, and an entire parallel fleet appeared at sea, operating by its own rules. Industry analysts estimate that Russia now controls more than 600 tankers outside Western jurisdiction. Many are registered under the flags of Liberia, Panama, Tanzania, or the Marshall Islands, countries where registration is easy and ownership disclosure is minimal. These vessels are called shadow ships because they often switch off tracking systems, alter routes, and transfer oil ship to ship in international waters. The core evasion schemes revolve around India, China, Singapore, Malaysia, and the United Arab Emirates. Oil shipped from Russian ports in the Baltic, or from Primorsk, for instance, is first transferred to another tanker in open waters. The cargo is then reclassified as a blend of mixed origin and sent for processing to Indian or Malaysian ports. Once refined, the fuel formally ceases to be Russian and is sold without issue to Europe or the United States under new certificates. India has become one of the key partners in this setup. Over the past 2 years, the country has increased purchases of Russian oil many times over, and now accounts for more than a third of Russia's exports. Indian refineries process the crude and then ship petroleum products worldwide, including to countries that imposed embargoes in the first place. On paper, sanctions are observed. In practice, Russian oil continues to circulate through the global market. Insurance is another critical piece of the puzzle. After British and European insurers stepped away from Russian cargoes, companies from China, India, and the Gulf filled the gap. Russia also set up domestic insurance pools to absorb part of the transport risk. This kept tankers moving even through areas subject to international restrictions. At the same time, Moscow bought up aging vessels from Western firms. Many were transferred to little-known offshore structures and kept running on the same routes, but with new paperwork and different flags. This made it possible to build an independent logistics chain capable of carrying up to 80% of export volumes without Western involvement. Another reason Russia didn't buckle under sanctions was a large-scale information and diplomatic campaign aimed at the global South. From the earliest months of pressure, Moscow made a simple case to partners. Sanctions imposed without a UN Security Council mandate lack international legitimacy. Today, they target one country. Tomorrow, they could be used against any state that refuses to play by someone else's rules. The argument resonated. For countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it was a warning. Without their own safeguards, they could be next. Step by step, Russia built a circle of countries unwilling to join the sanctions push. This went beyond political sympathy to concrete economic cooperation. In return, Moscow offered new tools, settlements in national currencies, domestic payment systems, alternative banks, and non-Western insurance mechanisms. For many states, this made it possible to keep trading without the risk of frozen accounts or blocked transactions. Against this backdrop, groupings once seen as marginal began to gain weight. BRICS, long dismissed as a loose club, evolved into a platform with its own financial ambitions. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, the UAE, and Ethiopia joined. Countries with different interests, but a shared skepticism toward unilateral sanctions. Today, BRICS countries account for nearly half the world's population and about a third of the global economy. Within the bloc, Russia has pushed hard for settlements in national currencies. The yuan played a particularly prominent role, rapidly gaining ground in international payments. In just 2 years, it entered the world's top 5 most used currencies, a visible sign of the dollar's eroding monopoly, a process accelerated by the attempt to isolate Russia. New trade routes are taking shape as well. Moscow is advancing the north-south corridor, linking the Baltic to Iran and India while bypassing the Suez Canal. What once sounded theoretical is now a working route with real cargo flows. Trade is pivoting toward Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, regions with growing economies and sustained demand for energy, grain, metals, and fertilizers. In effect, Russia has drawn a substantial share of the global south to its side, countries weary of external dictates and eager to set their own rules. That alignment created an economic and political buffer, allowing Russia not merely to endure sanctions, but to slot into a new system where decisions are no longer made in a single center, but across several, whatever one may claim. Paradoxically, it was Europe itself that became yet another factor helping Russia withstand sanctions pressure. Despite loud declarations of a complete break with Russian energy, the continent has in practice remained dependent on it. Sanctions on Russia's oil and gas sector were imposed at a moment when Europe simply wasn't ready. Storage levels were insufficient, alternative suppliers couldn't cover the volumes, and the much-vaunted green transition championed in Brussels turned out to be a polished theory with no solid foundation beneath it. Europe's energy system had been built around Russian supplies for far too long to be switched off overnight. Gas storage was filled largely through long-term contracts with Gazprom, and replacing them at a stroke proved impossible. Attempts to rapidly ramp up liquefied natural gas imports from the United States and Qatar only partially bridged the gap and drove energy costs up several-fold. Industry began to scale back, and electricity bills soared even for middle-class households. The green transition experiment exposed its own limits. Wind turbines and solar panels failed to meet industrial demand. Not a single major EU country managed to complete the shift to renewables within the promised timelines. Germany now speaks openly of the most expensive energy transition in human history. And this after abandoning cheap Russian gas while restarting coal-fired plants. Hungary and Slovakia, constrained by geography, never found viable alternatives to Russian energy at all. As a result, despite embargoes and grand slogans, supplies have continued, only now through intermediaries. Russia sells oil and refined products to India, which then resells them to Europe at 3 to 4 times the price. Formally, sanctions are observed. In reality, European factories and power plants are still running on the same Russian fuel, just routed differently and accompanied by new paperwork. The same pattern applies to gas. Through Turkey, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, or intermediary trading firms in Europe, the very same resource flows that once arrived directly. In practical terms, Europe is now in its 4th year of buying Russian energy in volumes not far from pre-sanctions levels. The difference is that direct contracts have been replaced by long chains of middlemen and familiar prices by a hefty premium for Europe's own political choices. Russia, having rerouted logistics and export channels, has preserved its revenues. Europe, having lost access to cheap energy, has undercut its own competitiveness. This imbalance became an unexpected advantage for Russia. Sanctions didn't destroy exports, they made them more profitable. Oil and gas now move through third countries with added margins, while Europe, eager to display independence, ends up paying more for the same energy. The outcome is stark. Russia retained its foreign currency inflows, while Europe created a new source of vulnerability within its own economy. From the entire sanctions saga, Europe emerges visibly weakened. Growth is slowing, industry is struggling, energy security rests on imports, and voices are growing louder that without dialogue with Russia there is no way forward. But the wheel is already in motion. 2022 marked a point of no return. A restructuring of global trade has begun. Old ties are breaking, new ones forming around different centers of power. Profound changes lie ahead, not only in logistics and settlements, but in the very architecture of the global economic order.